Hare Krishna. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you might be in the world. So this is a special episode of Vedic Inquirer live streams, looking at the recent GBC panel report. So 30 years ago, Lokanath Swami abused a minor, and the GBC have spent 30 years mishandling this. And now, with recent awareness about the case growing again, they hastily constituted some kind of ad hoc panel. That panel looks like it was given a brief to just give this some legalese, superficial perspective that everything has been in order. And we'll be unpacking that report and looking at that. I mean, the casual reader who's not legally minded may be bewildered by the way it's been written. We'll unpack that. Now, we may be joined later by Kirtana Rasa, who is a lawyer. I'm hoping he might at least be watching it online. He's had some difficulties getting in. But we'd like to welcome back a returning guest, Dhira Govinda Prabhu. Dhira Govinda Prabhu, you were CPO Director from the inception of the CPO, I think in 1998 through to about 2004.
Yes.
Please tell us a little bit about yourself, and particularly, I guess, your relationship with this case over the years.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Damodara Prabhu. Thanks for inviting me. And I would say I was looking forward also to be on with Kirtana Rasa Prabhu. I hope he comes on. When I was serving as director, we founded the Child Protection Office, which became known as the ISKCON Central Office of Child Protection, early in 1998, and I served as director till June of 2004. And actually, on occasion, Kirtana Rasa would support us with his legal expertise on a few cases, and I very much appreciated serving together with him. And so, yes, I served as CPO director for those a little over 6 years. Here's Kirtana Rasa.
Yes.
Hare Krishna.
I figured it out somehow.
Thank you, Kirtana Rasa. Dhira Govinda is just doing an introduction of himself, and then we'll introduce you as well. Please continue, Dhira Govinda ji.
Okay. And Kirtana Rasa, I was just saying how much I appreciated our collaborative service together back when I was serving as director of the CPO. There were some cases where we served together. Yeah. So I also, I served with many years, with the state of Florida in positions such as children and family counselor for the Department of Foster Care and medical social work director, social work services program manager for children's medical services. And I can talk about different aspects of my life, but yeah, so, pretty much, it was early April 1998 when we officially opened the Child Protection Office. For about a month before that, myself and the secretary of the office, E.J. Das Prabhu, for about a month, we prepared, then we officially announced opening, and we were flooded with, different services to do, and members of Prabhupada's movement and others writing to us about literally hundreds of cases. And pretty much immediately we were, we got a lot of communications about the case of Lokanath Swami, a lot of communications. And so that was kind of on the desk from the beginning. And I think anyone a little familiar with the case knows that the GBC bodies, they specifically asked for this case that the CPO doesn't handle it in according to our format of investigation adjudication. The idea being that the GBC said they already handled it, and I'll say that I was fine with that. I was never like the Child Protection Office should deal with it like that. I was like, oh, okay, the GBC's handling it. I was fine. I said, okay, because a lot of people, and I told members of the GBC, and this is all documented, like especially if readers read the appendices, they'll see this is all documented, like which members of the GBC I was in communications with about this case. And I said, okay, people are asking, so you've already dealt with it, so send me the official conclusion report adjudication, the official decision, and I'll send to them. And to make a long story short, for years, I got a runaround. Like they said, oh, this one has it. Oh, it's over here. Oh, anyhow, and that's documented. Yeah, there's other members of the GBC who are still members of the GBC, and they were writing to other members of the GBC back in 2001 saying, Dhira Govinda has been asking for this report for years now. And he's not saying the CPO should deal with it. He's just saying GBC dealt with it. Fine. Send me the report to send to people. Otherwise, people will think it's a cover up, or it's a diversion and it's a deception. Just send me the report to send to people. And we never did get that report. You know, and in the course of the years there, 98 to 04, I had several in-person conversations with Lokanath Swami and, you know, like that. So I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Prabhuji. And I will post the link to the appendices, because conspicuously the GBC decided not to actually disclose those. And I think it's because they're a little bit damning, because they show what the GBC knew, when they knew, and the various efforts to cover up. So we will, because it has actually been made available, we will actually share it ourselves with people. But let's introduce Kirtana Rasa Prabhu. Tell us a little bit about your history as a devotee, Kirtana Rasa Prabhu, and also your profession.
Thank you very much, Prabhu. Well, my eldest brother, Akshobhya Prabhu, a disciple of Srila Prabhupada, first and second, he was initiated back in 1970. And I was the grand age of 13 when that happened, and he was 20. So he brought home Krishna book, and that was the beginning of it for me. You know, Akshobhya was kind and generous and brilliant, and he was my hero, and he made me whatever, to the degree I'm a devotee, it's by his grace and his love and his patience. So I was initiated by Srila Satsrup Maharaj in January of 1979, and a month later, Akshobhya lost his life in Hawaii, coming to the aid of a devotee who was being attacked. And he didn't see the fellow had a knife and was stabbed in the heart. Now, Akshobhya, prior to that, along with Srikanta Prabhu, had developed a system of writing subject matter indexes that, you know, and I don't say this as a little brother or as him being my first real instructing guru, but this system of indexing is just brilliant. I was amazed at its complexity, at its subtleties. It's as much of an art as it is a science, and he invented it. And we can see now that system was used in the Bhagavatams. It was used in one edition of Krishna book that was published, but just prior to leaving, Akshobhya had finished the index to Nectar of Devotion, and that was the last index he wrote. After he left, I was inspired to try to learn his system. And I eventually went to the BBT in Los Angeles, where I indexed the Lilamrita, except for volume 2, which Sureshwar Prabhu did. I indexed Brahma Samhita, Ishopanishad, the Bhagavad Gita, the one with the doesn't index the purports because we were on a deadline, various other books. And I did that for a number of years, and then got married, had a child, and realized that I needed some way to support myself outside of being an indexer. And so I ended up going to law school in 1985 and graduated in 88. I was a prosecutor, a criminal prosecutor for the city of New Hampshire for my first, as my first gig. Still in my senior year of law school, prosecuting all sorts of misdemeanor and traffic crimes. I was the only one in my class that graduated with trial experience. And then I hit the ground running as a defense attorney. I've practiced civil rights law. I've spent many years representing children in family court. We used to be called law guardians, and now we're called AFCs, attorneys for children. So abuse cases, neglect cases, custody visitation cases. I represented adult litigants in family court. I served as a judge, town court judge on appointment for less than a year, but it was a lot of fun. I served as special district attorney, a special prosecutor in Warren County in the late 1990s on appointment when the regular DA had a conflict. So I have 2 stints as a criminal prosecutor, a lot of years as a criminal defense attorney, trying everything from speeding trials up to murder, sex abuse cases as well. And I've been a civil rights attorney suing police for misconduct and excessive force and false arrests. I've practiced a little bit of surrogate law, but not much. But basically criminal law, family law, since 1987. So it's, you know, I joke that it's too long a time to do anything, including being a quality control manager at a chocolate factory. It's a long time. So I'm going to my 35th year of dealing with the wreckage of humanity and all our foibles and failings.
Thank you very much, Prabhu. And of course, you know, I really wanted both of your backgrounds to be very apparent to viewers. We're looking at things, this panel report, both from a legal perspective. We're also looking at it from a child protection perspective. And, you know, both of you have a lot to contribute from that perspective. Thank you. So let me do a little bit of previewing. As I said, although this incident happened 30 years ago, the ongoing mishandling has been constant throughout those 30 years. The GBC initially became aware, at least certain members, in 1993 when the family spoke to them. First mistake, or, you know, grievous error, is that they chose not to involve law enforcement and they chose to keep it all quiet. They didn't even let the rest of the GBC know. I think it became apparent to others in 1998 when there started to be some news articles about it. And all of a sudden there was some scrambling around and so on. Initially there was just the slapped wrist, take a couple of years out of initiating and so on. Everything blew up again in around 2010 because the victim saw Maharaj. She'd been promised that he would never hold a distinctive position in the society again. And there he was leading New York Rath Yatra or something. It traumatized her all over again. She went public. Again, the GBC dealt with it. We have minutes in the appendices of a GBC meeting, I think 2011, 2012, where suddenly, shock and horror, other GBC members are finally aware of the grievous nature of the incident. Spookily, we don't really see how they did the about turn the following day and just gave them license to continue. That's not covered. And then you know, it's all come back again in the last year or so. So I have to say, as soon as I heard about this panel, and you may remember, Bhakti Chaitanya Swami absent-mindedly left his video on. And initially it was the Lokanath supporters that jumped all over this. Just see, we now have proof of a plot between the GBC leadership and the CPO. It's a done deal. They found him guilty. Actually, they'd completely misconstrued what they were watching. What we were actually seeing is an attempt with impunity to circumvent CPO. Let's set up this panel. And if they tell us that there's no action further required, then that's it. It's all over. Those are, you know, Maharaj's exact words. And so then the panel was set up. We were surprised to learn that of the 5 members, there were 2 former CPO directors, notably not Dhira Govinda, a former CPO, the only former CPO director who was not invited to be a part of proceedings. And then, shockingly, 2 avid, avowed Lokanath supporters. So of a 5-member panel, 2 Lokanath supporters, and then a lawyer. And it's pretty clear that the panel report was written by a lawyer. It's also pretty clear that the composition of that panel skewed the voting. It wasn't a majority. It wasn't a consensus. There's a majority opinion and a minority opinion. So we'd like to walk through that report and analyze the various arguments that are made in it, because not everyone's going to read that report, and some may also be, you know, beguiled by the smoke and mirrors that are going on in the report to cover up what's actually being done here. And so we'll go through it in detail. But first, I'd like to ask each of you, what was your general impression of reading the report? Perhaps Dhira Govinda Prabhu, you can begin.
Okay. Well, I'll say I really, it was just like two days ago after I was invited to this panel that I read the report. So actually, it's not like I'm keeping close tabs on such things, but you know, I do have a lot of history in child maltreatment prevention in the ISKCON organization. So I'm glad to be invited. So I did read the report. Also read the appendices. Many of the documents in the appendices I'm already very familiar with, going back to 25 years or so. So I read the report. That said, I don't want to claim that I closely studied the report. I did read it. Okay, I just want to be clear. Okay, and you asked me my impressions. Yeah. Okay. It seems that yeah, it's very legalistic. It's legalistic, and actually, I'm interested and eager to hear Kirtana Rasa's view from a legal point of view. You know, I mean, I have some experience in courts and adjudications, but it's not my field of expertise. So I could see that they gave time to structure the report with the minority view represented there, and okay, and it's I found you used the term legalese. When I say legalistic, I don't necessarily mean that in a critical way. I just mean they're using legal language, and there's a place for that. And it seems like there's some sophistication there. And then then the result. Okay, so basically, in my understanding, here in Prabhupada's movement from Prabhupada's teachings, or I'll take a step back, like in basic sociology, I'd say like more and more people, if they're looking like to be connected with spiritual organization, religious organization, they are looking, this is just common sense, and research will bear this out. They're looking at how are the children and women treated. It's just a main thing that people are looking at when they're looking at like a spiritual institution or an institution purported to be spiritual religious. So I mean, that's definitely there. And the, let's call it the philosophy that Prabhupada gave us. I'll just talk about the aspect of, let's say, okay, like, Srila Prabhupada gave us an altar with like his pictures on the altar, and Srila Bhakti Siddhanta and Vaishnavacharyas and the six Goswamis and Srimati Radharani and Sri Krishna and the Panchatattva, like that. And all personalities on the altar are, of course, completely free of any tinge of the modes of material nature. And that's what Prabhupada gave us. And so I'll talk in terms of the guru. Like, of course, I know I have many gurus, like so many people have inspired me. Kirtana Rasa Prabhu talked about how his dear brother inspired him, first instructing guru. I have my Pradarshak guru. We all have many gurus. And then there's the guru. And the guru, who's like the guru to whom we endeavor to surrender absolutely the guru, according to the philosophy we get from Srila Prabhupada, the guru is completely free from any tinge of the modes of material nature, and like those pictures on the altar, they're not representations of the person. Prabhupada emphasizes, just as Krishna is fully 100% present in his picture, so similarly, the acharyas are 100% present in their photos. It's like a vapu form, and so the guru is actually served, honored, and worshipped as non-different from God, non-different from Krishna. So the result of the 75-page report and the 240 pages of appendix of appendices is that you have someone. I'm not even saying that this is wrong. I'm just kind of trying to give it a. You have someone who is who is worshipped as non-different from God, who in this lifetime committed sexual maltreatment against an 11-year-old girl, committed a child sex crime that what we read in the report would be like, it's regarded as a felony in the USA, at least 7 years in prison. I read that. So, I mean, like I'm just giving it as it is. And it would seem like that would be difficult to explain to people. And that's why a lot of the report seems like tap dancing.
Yeah, tap dancing was funny enough. The same characterization I gave Anutam as accompanying Q&A. He actually poses the question, so does this mean that someone who's sexually assaulted a child can be a guru? And then he completely avoids answering the question. The obvious answer is, apparently now, if you have leverage and friends in high places, that is exactly the precedent that has been set. And yes, there's a lot of tap dancing to try and make all of that seem okay. Definitely struck me. This was a document written by someone utilizing every legal smoke and mirrors in the book to try and defend the indefensible and give it the superficial, appearance of all being above board. Kirtana Rasa, I mean, you're a lawyer, so you will probably know better than us what was going on in the language of the report. What was your impressions when you first read it?
Well, I think that anybody who reads the report has to understand the context in which it was written. One of my failings and one of my assets at the same time is a love for history. And if I'm not reading Prabhupada's books, that's what I'm reading. I'm reading history. And Srila Prabhupada said one time that a gentleman knows what's going on in his own country. So that doesn't mean we become overly involved, but you still, to understand what's going on in your own country, you need a context. You need the historical context. And what this case reminds me of is the United States in the 1850s. We were about to come apart at the seams because you had the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery and the Missouri Compromise and the whole, some newly admitted territories coming in as slave states, some not coming in, and everyone was trying to patch the thing together and hold the country together with spit and baling wire to stop the fracture. And because the threat was coming from the South that unless you give us what we want, which is the right to own, abuse, sell, rape, and kill our fellow human beings of a different color, we're going to leave the country. And of course, ultimately, the Missouri Compromise didn't work, and the country came apart. What I see when I read this report is a context of a certain fraction of our movement, either explicitly or implicitly saying that take any action that we find unacceptable, I mean, really unacceptable, against Lokanath. And you'll forgive me, but I'm not going to use the word Swami in relationship to a child molester. I'm just not. If we take any action against him, well, we're going to pick up our toys and go somewhere else. And that's the threat under which this report was written. And I see this report as the spit and baling wire that's trying to hold the movement together. But I remember a letter that John Adams wrote to his son. And John Adams told his son, never put your integrity within the reach of another man. And ultimately, we're supposed to trust and depend on Krishna. Hey, I'm guilty of not doing that. I'm the first one to say I'm attracted to people of faith because I myself don't have enough. But ultimately, we're supposed to trust Krishna. And the way we trust Krishna is we stay within our integrity to Srila Prabhupada. We stay within our integrity to the teachings of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And we don't succumb to threats of political civil war, because ultimately we know that this movement is under the protection of Krishna, and that its propagation is not dependent upon the political clout of any one person or any group of people. Now that's hard to see when you've got a gun to your head. But if you look at the last 30 years since Lokanath's criminal act, and he is an unindicted felon by his own admission. That's the basis we have to go into this report on. There's not a question of fact here. He's admitted guilt. And in New Jersey at the time, the penalty was up to 7 years. In New York State, it's also up to 7 years. He'd be a registered sex offender. He would have been exposed to prison time. He wrote a letter. He confessed. So we're not talking about, did the child protection officer GBC find him guilty? He found himself guilty by his own admission. So that's the context we have to view this report in. And so what's the purpose of the report? Well, the purpose of the report is to try to find a way to justify and rationalize not stepping outside our integrity. Because our integrity requires us to not have someone who is an admitted and confessed child molester in a position of authority and power. Now, one of the first things I found wrong with the report, and it's kind of like you test the grain of rice in the pot to see if the rest of the rice is done. The authors tried to say, well, he's not a pedophile because this 11-and-a-half-year-old girl was in, transition from childhood to, well, really, you know when she had her first period? That's not in the report. Pedophilia is not sex with teenagers. Pedophilia is a sexual attraction to a prepubescent child. And so whether she was prepubescent or had just crossed the threshold into puberty, it's kind of irrelevant because it's either pedophilia or it's sexual assault on someone who's still a child anyway. So they try to draw this distinction between, well, he's not a pedophile. Okay, but he's a sexual predator. So what's your point? I mean, he was bad, but he could have been worse. That defense doesn't work in criminal court. Believe me, I've tried it. Okay, my client's been bad, Your Honor, but he could have been worse. Instead of just raping the woman, he could have killed her too. Doesn't he get points for not killing her? So that defense is rejected by the law. So it tries to blur the fact that he is, by his own admission, a sexual predator by saying, well, geez, he's not a pedophile. And we know he's not a pedophile because we had a person that I believe only had an MSW, a Master in Social Work, sit down with the guy for 2 days and interview him. That person's not qualified. Unless you have a PhD in psychology and specific training, there are a whole battery now of written tests that can be given to someone to determine if they're a sexual predator, if they're a pedophile, and what their likely reoffending risk is. It's a pretty detailed, comprehensive system, and an MSW is not qualified to do it. It's like sending a physician's assistant in to do neurosurgery. Okay? You're not a doctor, you're a physician's assistant, and you're certainly not a surgeon. So they try to the report tries to let Lokanath off the hook by making this completely irrelevant distinction between he's not a pedophile versus a sexual predator. It's a moot point. And then they try to bolster that with the work of an unqualified person who has no business making that diagnosis. And it's all downhill from there. Okay. The context this report has to be looked at is this. This is not a fall down. Okay? I don't want to use that word. There's a great purport in the Bhagavad Gita that has been used in more than one instance when a sannyasi has had a consensual sexual relationship with another adult, whether a woman or a man, right? That's not rape. That's not sexual assault. That's two adults consenting to break their vows, to leave their ashram, and to have sex. This is predation, right? An 11-and-a-half-year-old is incapable of giving consent as to what she wants for dinner, what to speak of whether or not she's going to have sex with a guy that's 30 years older than her. So that idea that we can rehabilitate someone, even if it was true, let's just play devil's advocate and accept for a minute that that's true. How do we spin that to the rest of the world? How do we put makeup on that pig and convince people to kiss it? And so we have a movement that's dependent upon preaching and upon people looking at us and saying, yeah, they're the real deal. And now we have someone who has a very public profile, who's consolidated a power base of what, 5,000 disciples in the last 30 years? It's some outrageous number. That's not an accident. That's building a power base to protect his position. And now, because the GBC failed to act when it should have, instead of dealing with one sannyasi with maybe a few disciples or no disciples, now you have a force of nature with 5,000 disciples. What's going to be the shockwaves that go around the world if the right thing is done now rather than it was done 30 years ago? I'm not arguing against the right thing. I still think we need to do the right thing. But that's what he's used these 30 years to do. He's really insulated himself. So we have to look, if he was sincerely dedicated to Prabhupada's movement, he would step back and look at this and say, what's the public relation nightmare involved in having someone who has admittedly sexually molested a child? Whether she had just menstruated that year or not, she's a child. What is the political and public relations fallout to that? You know what? I'm going to step back. I'm going to take the humble position, and I'm going to go somewhere and wash the pots in the kitchen and chant Hare Krishna and not embarrass my spiritual master's movement by being the public face of ISKCON anywhere in the world where underneath my name is child molester. So the humble thing to do, the right thing to do, the thing to do that has integrity with it, is to say, this wasn't just a fall down with me and a woman. I can come back from this. And you know what? He could have. Many people have. And we give him a second chance, and we take Prabhupada's purport in the Gita seriously, where he says, if you rectify, et cetera, et cetera. But child molestation is in a category by itself. It's all alone. It's like the old joke about the Irish stonemason who is complaining in a bar about, you see that chapel, my sons and I took 5 years and we built that, but does anybody say, there goes Patrick, the wonderful stonemason. And there's that bridge that we cross every time we come to town that took me a whole summer to put together. But does anybody say, oh, Patrick, he's been a great stonemason for 20 years. Look at that wonderful bridge. But you get caught with one sheep in your pants down, and forever you're Patrick the sheep scorer. So that's the taint that comes with this kind of crime. You can't wash it off. You can't wash it off. There's no coming back from this. And that's the political and public relation reality that he refuses to accept and that the GBC fails to recognize.
Thanks, Prabhu. And let's we've promised our viewers that we'll actually walk through the report. So what I'll do is I will share my screen and we'll look at certain pages and certain arguments that are made. Hopefully people will be encouraged to actually read the report and the appendices, but at least we can do some analysis together. So I think I first went through this around April, shortly after it was written. And I remember even by the time I'd got about halfway through, I was just fuming, because even without a legal background, I could see the smoke and mirrors. So here we are, it's the initial setup. This panel was constituted by the GBC body in September 2021 for inter alia the following purposes. Now, the purposes that they then list are in fact the scope of the GBC directive to them. But it was really interesting for a start to read inter alia, which basically Latin term meaning amongst other things. And I would observe, having read the report, that in fact it tries to exceed the scope that was given by the GBC, and possibly this little inter alia, I'm going to let you know up front that in fact we're going to do with other things as well that we've just appointed ourselves for. I was just curious, Kirtana Rasa, this term inter alia, obviously it's a Latin word, but is it used frequently in law, and is it used exactly like that to try and you know, sneak a few other pieces of evidence or whatever under the radar?
Well, Latin generally in the law is on a downward slide. I used to see it a lot more 30 years ago than I see it now, but it's a fairly innocuous term. It's just kind of an umbrella that, oh, by the way, we're going to encompass this as well. It's minutia.
I was concerned in particular, and we'll come to this, at the attempt to actually make the panel into a task force, which is something that CPO guidelines make provision for. So we can see that they've consistently withheld things from the CPO. But then at some point, they actually try to claim that this is a legitimate alternative, even though, and the minority points this out, that was never an authority that was granted to them. Anyway, so why did they put the report together? Baseline of facts and evidence. Even as we've agreed already that it's been well known for some time by anybody looking at the available evidence that there's no doubt that the crime was committed, the crime of sexual assault of a minor. There clearly was a lot of disinformation, and perhaps even the GBC themselves were confused. And so I think the report definitely does leave the reader in absolutely no doubt as to what transpired. All right, assess and review the facts and evaluate the evidence. Review the manner in which the previous investigations and adjudications were handled, and whatever sanctions were given, and then to make some recommendations to the GBC. So a little bit of preamble at the beginning of the report, what the report sets out to do, and it sort of ticks those boxes. It does cover such ground. All right, factual background.
Well, let me just throw one thing in really quick. When you throw in a term like evaluate the evidence, implicit in that phrase is that the evidence, one, needs to be evaluated, and that there are different ways to look at it. That the evidence may rise to a certain level, or there's different views of it. He confessed. Why do they need to evaluate the evidence? All they need to recognize is we have a confession. We have an admission by the perpetrator. So it's not that there could be two different views of whether the evidence rises to a certain level of proof or what it means or what it doesn't mean. He confessed. End of story.
Of course, there are lots of people, his followers in particular, who try to contest that he ever penned the letter. The appendices actually demonstrates his attempts to steer the letter to a more sanitized view. But it's true that it was actually compiled by a number of authors. Certainly he signed it. And so however he tries to spin it, or however anyone tries to spin it, that is, a definitive confession. And yes, you can even see every attempt that he made to make it seem a little bit, better. So a little bit of context. He was staying in the Pandy home because he'd broken his leg, or he'd injured himself. We hear everything from, sore ankles to broken legs and so on. But, Mr. Pandy took some compassion on the difficulty of going up and down stairs. Why don't you stay in my home? And so on. And then over the course of the week that Lokanath Swami stayed there were harmonium lessons. Mr. Pandy said, I wonder if you can introduce Indian culture to my daughter, 11-year-old daughter. And then we can see repeated groomings and inappropriate touches, touching her on the leg. Very good. Reading aloud from Krishna book, no one else in the room, reading from between half an hour and an hour, and resting. Here it's saying resting some part on Satya's leg. In fact, we get several different versions of this event that's mentioned here. And then there's also the patting on the behind that happens, and waking her up. I mean, just a series of events. We do have all of this in the appendix, and it's making reference to the appendix. I've put the links to the appendices in the thread, so you can actually look at all of this. But yeah, so we're having different versions here. So removing hand, it's not actually clear there where the hand is touching, but we'll get there. What part of the body did he touch? My private area, her secret part, my crotch. And here, including the private area. So this is even in his words. Again, his words, I sense my hand touched her private part. Badru Narayan in 2011 goes, much more graphic. He took his hand, felt her vagina, moved his hand back after she moved away, felt her out. So it's very, very graphic. So, I mean, the point is, the panel is making reference to every single different account at different times that are given on what happened. That's all part of the evidence. I'll pause while I'm just scrolling here in case any of you want to, make any comments about what I've said so far.
There was one other part of the beginning of the report which I think revealed it for what it was, just an apologist's attempt to whitewash, where they try to mitigate or excuse his conduct based on him coming from an Indian culture, where he wasn't used to the decadent. I'm sorry, he was in his 40s at the time. He'd been in a male body. He'd been out of puberty for 25 years. He was well acquainted with his own biological urges and his own genitalia. You can't excuse somebody because they come from a different culture. There are certain cross-cultural mores that I like. Aristotle. Aristotle had a proof for God, and one of Aristotle's proofs for God was that no matter what culture you look at, every culture has a concept of divinity and supreme being or supreme beings. And so it's inherent in human nature, and therefore it's inherent in human nature because God really exists. I thought that was an interesting reason. You could apply that to this too. It's with some rare exceptions, such as the Athenians in ancient Greece, adults preying upon children sexually is found abhorrent in every culture, in every human experience. And so this idea that somehow, because he wasn't raised a degenerate white person like we were, he somehow or other, this took him by surprise and he doesn't have the same culpability that one of us would have, is just intellectual sophistry and dishonesty. And that, to me, that taints the report right from the outset.
Well, and some of his followers have even gone as far as to say that the CAP report, and we'll come to their account shortly, went as far to not only exonerate him of abuse, but saying it was even impossible for him to have any sexual desires. I mean, it's really been spun in incredibly ways. And of course, we have a lot of people who are coming to the painful realization that the person they look to as good as God, and the person who's their ticket back home, back to Godhead, has done something of this nature. And they're desperately, desperately trying to provide their alternative facts. I'll pause just in case Dhira Govinda has something. Otherwise, I'm keen to keep going through the document itself.
Please keep going.
Okay, so I think some of what you were just saying, Kirtana Rasa was here, Lokanath. I was so unfamiliar with these things that I didn't even know what was going on. So what was the extent of the cutting? So procedural history is then covered. What was the process followed? Virabahu, GBC chairman at the time, appointed the 7-member committee. It's worth noticing that the rest of the GBC were not informed at this time. So the 7-man committee, names mentioned here, were the ones who decided how to handle it. This handling did include not mandatory reporting to the New Jersey authorities. They sent someone called Jasoda, who was a disciple, I believe, of Bir Krishna Maharaj, to interview. So this is now happening 3 years later. The event happened in 1990. 3 years later, the family reports the matter. The child actually reported next day or even later that day to her mother. And I think the family were just, completely distraught and bewildered. Apparently the father was never informed, and we'll see some coverage of that as we go. So what did they decide to do? Let's involve the Child Abuse and Prevention Behavior Associates, the CAP team. This is Ken Cullen, I believe, and a group of people who were subsequently struck off for all kinds of fraudulent and other kinds of behavior. And typically they were the, expert witnesses for hire when priests were having themselves defended. So even though they talk about themselves, doing rehab and evaluating priests, they were typically employed by the defense. So there's definitely massive credibility questions here. All right, so Ravinder Swarup wrote this in 1999. Or we'll see this. Yeah. So the CAP team made the following findings. Now it's important to say we still yet to see the actual CAP document. This is Ravinder Swarup or the GBC's. This is what they told us. He's not a paedophile. He represents no danger, and I think you've covered that, Kirtana Rasa. Who evaluated, and how is it even a moot point? Although the girl was young, she began to transition. I mean, this is a really horrible, even thing to try and argue. It's not really, child abuse, and it shouldn't, really gross us out because, apparently she was looking more like a woman, this 11-and-a-half-year-old. I mean, it's shocking that even someone would attempt to do this.
It's abhorrent. It really is. And it's intellectually dishonest. That's the problem. Anybody with any kind of critical reasoning ability is going to see right through it. What they're doing here is they're playing to the cheap seats. And unfortunately, most of the seats in the theater are cheap seats.
And here we see exactly the argument that you were talking about. Oh, well, he was just so innocent, he couldn't, these were unfamiliar feelings and they just overwhelmed him. And this was such an extraordinary situation. So you can see all the way they're trying to build the case. I think we just let this one go. A highly unusual concatenation of circumstances. And then this was really interesting. So apparently this is an argument CAP associate is making. Poor old Lokanath Swami, his entire identity and sense of self is built upon his role as a religious leader, and it's a role to which he's exceptionally well suited. So maybe we just let him continue. It's bizarre. I mean, we've often observed that even the school janitor would not get issued with another job if he'd, contravened child safety in some ways. And here we're saying, here was someone who was invited in the home on the basis of being a trusted religious leader, completely abused that trust. Let's let him continue in that position. It's just the most extraordinary argument ever. I'll pause to see if either of you have any comments about that.
Well, I have a lot of experience in dealing with insular cultures. The bar, the community of attorneys is an insular culture. The judiciary is an insular culture. Police departments are an insular culture, and religious institutions tend to be insular cultures. There's a clear delineation of us and them, and we protect our own. I see this all the time, and to protect our own only comes at the price of sacrificing the collective integrity. Cops who protect dirty cops jeopardize the integrity of the entire police force. Lawyers who protect other unethical lawyers, besmirch the noble profession of practicing law. And so we have a similar mentality at work here, I think, is that we've seen it time and time again with the Catholics. And I went to Catholic school. I got beat by nuns, and it was a horrible experience. But fortunately, I escaped sexual abuse that was going on there. But we've seen how the Catholics have put their protecting their own values above the integrity of their philosophy and of their institution. And you'd think we'd learn from history and not repeat that mistake. But apparently there aren't many history fans on the GBC.
It's shocking, after Me Too movements and what's transpired since the 90s. I'm not saying it was ever excusable, the handling in the 90s. It completely beggars belief that 30 years later, with this continually resurfing in the clear light of day, they attempt to just get this to go away with some superficial, legalistic argument. All right, so I'm going to keep going because I'm mindful at the moment they're just regurgitating. So the panel is really just regurgitating previous things to get the reader up to speed. We've yet to see their own skullduggery, but we'll get there. And so
I thought to comment on that point that he's particularly Lokanath Swami is particularly well suited to be a religious spiritual leader. Okay, so leadership in essence, it's not a position, it's not a title. So if Lokanath Swami, and I want to say with reference to the Apichet Sudaracharo Bhajati Mama Nanya Bhak verse, that like personally, I'm not claiming to know what's in Lokanath Swami's heart, what's his relationship with Krishna, with Srila Prabhupada, whether there are nartas, not nartas. I'm not claiming any, I'm not claiming to have any absolute insight about that. At the same time, if he's naturally a spiritual leader, let him be a spiritual leader. And leadership is a way of being. It's not essentially a position or a title. It's not essentially a position. But what I'm meaning is, okay, he committed the crime he committed. And then if people, if people are naturally inspired, then and he's inspiring them spiritually in some way, in a genuine way, not in a pretentious or cheating way, then that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Let him be a leader by his character. At the same time, if he's and I'll also, going back to 1998, I had conversations with members of ISKCON leadership, members of the GBC, about this very point. And they were expressing to me that, look, Lokanath Swami, like, there's nothing, he has nothing else to do with his life if he's not like in the guru position. So, and, it never sat well with me, but I'm just sharing that what's in this report. I've been hearing that pretty much since I assumed the directorship of the CPO in 1998. And so, yeah, but then why, if he's attached to the position or title of some leadership in the institution, then it's actually a disservice to him to let him continue in a position and to nurture that attachment related to what Kirtana Rasa said, in a way that compromises the integrity of Srila Prabhupada's movement, and and it's not good for him spiritually to just feed that anarta of attachment to distinction and adoration and popularity and compliments. It's not good for him. So as Kirtana Rasa said, again, I don't know what's in his heart, but it would seem to me if he says, "Yeah, I'm not going to accept any positions. I committed this crime," and then maybe someone's genuinely inspired by his humility to become more humble themselves. Then that's wonderful. But why to nourish that anarta of attachment to religious leader, religious position? I'm reminded of a quote you're probably all familiar with from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. And for me, it's very alive here. Bhaktisiddhanta said, he wrote, the churches, and in this case, I believe it's the ISKCON institution, the churches have always proved the staunchest upholders of the grossest form of worldliness from which even the worst non-ecclesiastical criminals are found to recoil. So I'm seeing that as very pertinent here. Like I can imagine, let's say we imagine in the prisons, criminals in the prisons who've committed varieties of crime, including some of the most serious nature. And then they hear that, okay, so in your quote religious spiritual institution, so the institutional policy, we're like the criminals are hearing this. The institutional policy is that someone who sexually maltreated an 11-year-old girl, his picture is worshipped on the same altar as Mother Mary. I'm making the parallels here. Like we know, like theologically, Mother Mary and Srimati Radharani, it's not the same. But I'm just trying to make the parallels, right? We can imagine, even as Bhakti said, even the worst non-ecclesiastical criminals, right? They would be disgusted that someone someone who molested a girl, that's someone molested a girl, and then he's gone through his process of looking at himself, and maybe some people are inspired by him. Okay, but he's worshipped as God. He's worshipped as non-different than Jesus, and he molested 11-year. I mean, the worst non-ecclesiastical criminals would be, they would be found to recoil. But so I'm just saying Bhaktisiddhanta's words very, very alive and undeniably present here. And the only way for them to not be present is to do a whole lot of tap dancing and to hope that people just don't think about things very clearly.
And we know that in prisons, those who molest children often need to be protected from the other prisoners, because they're considered, even amongst the prison population, to be the lowest of the low, and fair game, to be taken out, summary justice, and so on. So let's just have a look at the end here of this is a direct verbatim quote, I believe, from the report that CAP Associates. We do not believe that Lokanath Swami suffers from any paraphiliac condition. So, it's a belief and does not pose a danger of overt sexual violence. Of course, there is a current rape allegation, so this may have been proven to be a very, very poorly conceived belief, and certainly not a very intelligent thing to offer. As Kirtana Rasa said, had he been reported back in 1993, he may not have only had prison time, but be on a sex offenders register for the rest of his life. And it could be that we've allowed a high-risk individual to perpetrate more crimes here. Now, I thought here the use of the passive voice by that CAP Associates was very interesting. They don't actually mention that he abused the child, but that she, as the recipient of these acts, may have experienced many traumatic sequelae common to victims of sexual abuse. So she may well go through the same trauma that people who are sexually abused experience, but it sort of stops short of saying he abused her. I mean, it's fascinating, just the words that are used to try and dress things up.
Yeah, I just want to appreciate that point. I don't know if appreciate's the right word, but there's definitely some avoidance of responsibility in that wording, and there's the wording would indicate some sort of agenda other than straightforward honesty. True.
Yeah. The whole theme of this report is to excuse and minimize. I mean, let's set aside the issue of whether he's likely to reoffend. I mean, they go off at some length about how he's not likely to reoffend. Oh, it's okay. He only robbed one bank. He probably won't rob another. So he gets a free pass for robbing the bank? No. He sexually assaulted a child. And whether or not he'll do it again, that's an academic point. Let's hold responsibility to anyone in our movement that sexually assaults a child. Whether or not they will do it again is not the main issue. The main issue is they have to be culpable for what they have done. We can speculate about what they'll do or what they won't do going forward, but there's got to be accountability for what the person did, what they admitted to doing. Otherwise, we are outside our integrity.
Yeah, very, very good point, Prabhuji. Thank you for that. So then we come to, what did that initial 1993 committee conclude? Apichet Sudaracharo. It was an accidental mistake. Again, very subjective point of view.
I just remembered the talk show host, Dick Cavett, was asked how he lost his virginity, and he said it was an accident. There's no accident here. There's, accident again. In the law, there's intentional acts, mens rea, the mental state, mens rea of intent. There's recklessness, which is you don't intend to be reckless, and there's negligence. So it's either negligent, reckless, or intentional. You don't put your hand on the private parts of a female. I mean, sure, you're on a crowded subway and you bump into somebody and one of the parts of you touch something that it shouldn't. That's negligent. That's reckless. This was intentional. And they're trying to obscure the intentionality of this act.
It was repeated number of times. We hear about the hand being put back whenever someone walked past the room. So yes, it can't be argued this was just the unintentional brush of a thigh, as some has sought to argue. This is, again, just apologetics. We see here the mention that the CAP report, the panel weren't able to get a copy, so we only have those excerpts that are quoted. Okay, this idea, it wasn't planned or premeditated, and yet it did happen multiple times over the course of a week. So it wasn't that there was instant mortification and removal from the environment.
Most homicides are not planned or premeditated. Most homicides are crimes of passion, and you don't get a pass for killing the guy that you came home and found in bed with your wife because it was a crime of passion. Maybe it gets down to manslaughter, but you still do time.
Well, especially if we call someone a swami that controls their senses or whatever. Okay. You know, we have the Manasa Vega, Vacha Vega, Manasa Kroda Vega. We have that verse that say you've got to actually have your urges under control if you're going to initiate and going to be a guru of people. And if we've got someone who's literally that uncontrolled that they can't even restrain themselves in the presence of a child, and we're going to say, please carry on. Yeah. That's just extraordinary. So what happened back in 1993? There was a 2.5-year restriction from initiations. And then 1997, maybe we should make sure that he always lets his disciples know. Now, this becomes an interesting point because they later say he's largely or primarily or some word like that substantially followed the restrictions. The fact is he withdrew the already very diluted account that was supposed to be given to all disciples. And this is part of the reason there's such an uproar now amongst the disciples is he has kept them in the dark. So even though they were actually meant to be informed, this is what, has happened. Even those who were informed were basically told, well, we kind of have to tell you this, but it's not real. And therefore we have a lot of people feeling like Maharaj is being maligned. Okay, so then we get to the GBC route.
I'll just say that, as far as like his rectification plan, that one to actually like write a sincere letter and being responsible that his disciples or prospective disciples read the letter, that was by far, from my point of view, that was by far and is by far the most challenging part that required the most vulnerability, courage, and integrity. And so for this report to say he basically followed everything except for that, well, that's for me that's like 90%. That's like 90% of where his rectification is, and my experience back then from 98 to 2004, he was fiercely trying to avoid that in deceptive ways. And I appreciated my personal connections with Lokanath Swami, and and also I noticed he had some what I would consider shortcomings, and he was and even we read like, he thought that some senior disciples would show some other disciples. So it seems to me very disingenuous for he followed everything except that. Like that's like 90% of the thing. Yeah. So like don't say follow everything. Like more truthful is that he neglected the most important part of his rectification plan. Now, even if he 100% followed his rectification plan with full sincerity, why would he be in the position of guru, worshipped absolutely as God? That still would make non-ecclesiastical criminals recoil. But I just want to make that point there.
Yeah, thank you, Prabhu. So then it came up again in 2010. So again, we're just going through the panel report's review of what's happened in the past. Satya then made an updated statement 20 years on, and particularly triggered not just, it causes trauma to a victim to see her perpetrator still held up as a worshipful person, top billing at certain events. And she was also outraged, A, because the promise that he would be dealt with was not carried out, and B, even the events were minimized in some of the official releases about this. So they do a little bit of, okay, she said slightly different things at different times. I don't think there's anything that substantial. Of course, those trying to be apologists for Lokanath Swami will try and say, oh, either she didn't write the update or she changed her mind. And obviously what she reported in 1993 as a 14-year-old, and how she might choose to articulate things later. I also think we have just the record of Satya's questions and her answers, and presumably even that was transcribed. That doesn't mean that's all she ever said on the subject. It's just that's all we can review. I don't think it's surprising at all that, particularly having seen how the whole thing was characterized and the minimization attempts, she would be a little bit more, let me tell you what happened here. So anyway, there's a little bit of information there. I don't know that it's hugely valuable to look at those here. We can come back to it if there's Q&A. To me, it's very, very consistent, as opposed to those who would try and argue that it makes one of the testimonies or both testimonies less credible. I'll pause just in case you have anything on that while I scroll to the next things.
Well, I wanted to comment on the use of the word rectification, and make the point that there's rectification on a personal, individual level in one's spiritual life, which, of course, I'm not discounting the possibility of Lokanath or anyone else who's done something abhorrent rectifying. But rectification, again, it's a distraction, because whether or not he can be rectified for what he did is not the point that we have to deal with exclusively as a society. We have to confront the reality of how what he did is being perceived by the people that we're trying to persuade to be Krishna conscious, i.e. the rest of the world. And if the rest of the world, as Dhira Govinda is saying, sees us with a picture of a confessed, self-confessed, admitted child molester on the altar, being worshipped as the conduit to God, no amount of personal rectification that he's been able to accomplish is going to avert the public relation nightmare. If I had, when I was 14, I went to my first temple at Bury Place in London in 1972. If someone had told me then that, there's a picture on the altar of someone who is a child molester, that would have been the last temple I ever went to. How many people are going to be chased away from Krishna consciousness? It's like, I remember reading Monkey on a Stick and thinking every new devotee that joins the temple should have to read this book. Because we can't abandon our critical thinking when we become devotees, and we can't blindly follow, and we can't be dogmatic to the point of accepting unconscionable behavior. Being a devotee does not relieve us from the obligation of being a gentleman or a lady. Being a gentleman or a lady is a precursor to being a devotee. And too often I see this mentality, again, the insular society, the us and them. I don't have to adhere to mundane concepts of morality. I don't have to adhere to mundane concepts of ethics because I'm a devotee. That's not what Srila Prabhupada taught us. I remember he was I think it was in Paris, and he was about to go up the stairs, and there was an elderly lady coming down. And Prabhupada stepped down and stepped back and gave her passage because he was a gentleman. He didn't abandon the etiquette of being a gentleman, and we can't abandon it either. Otherwise, we are in for a public relations nightmare. It's bad enough we survived Kirtanananda and Hansadura. Now we have to survive this, and at least we had some mental illness that we could use to explain them, and at least the GBC finally kicked New Vrindavan out of the fold because of Kirtanananda, and he ended up going to prison. So at least we had the cover of, hey, we cooperated with the federal authorities in the criminal prosecution of this aberrant stray. But there's no aberrant stray here being prosecuted by the secular authorities with the assistance of the GBC. This is not Kirtanananda. This is someone we have decided, we as a collective society have decided that rather than risk civil war and rather than risk a whole block of the Indian movement leaving ISKCON, we're just going to write this report, which is intellectually dishonest, sophomoric, and obscures the real issues because we wanted desperate to keep the Union together. It's a mistake that we made in the 1850s in this country, and we're making it again in this movement.
It's a good point. I mean, in the Q&A that accompanied the final release of this report, Anutama at some point actually makes the sort of confession, yeah, we knew we couldn't please everybody, we were going to upset somebody. What he doesn't then say is the ... We chose to pacify India at all costs.
Right.
And we chose to disregard the feelings of, devotees elsewhere. And in fact, as you say, the feelings of the general community to whom we're trying to take Krishna consciousness. So,
and this is what's going to happen time and time again if we continue to exclude the secular authorities, because again, it's part of the insular mentality. Well, they're karmis, and we're not subjected to them. When I was living at the BBT in Los Angeles, there was a nursery in one of the buildings next to the Brahmacharya ashram, and the husband of the woman who ran the nursery was caught molesting a child. And the temple president and the temple authorities cooperated fully with the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. And that person went to prison. There was no cover-up. There was no, we're going to shield this guy, we're going to ship him off to a different temple and not tell anybody. He was caught molesting young children, and the temple cooperated with the secular law enforcement authorities. And that has to be the guiding light going forward. Look, I've practiced law for 35 years, and I'll be the first one to tell you that the criminal justice system is severely flawed on many levels and in many ways. But it's what we have. And it's fairly reliable with lots of exceptions. But we have to bring in law enforcement in cases like this. If we don't, we expose ourselves to political blackmail, which is what's essentially happening right now with the devotees in India. If you come after our guru, we're going to take India away from ISKCON.
And so here we see that in 2010, Satya's going live with her, let me update you on what happened, sort of 20 years on. The other GBC members thought, oh, we've actually been sold a lighter version of events. This is much more severe. We want to talk about it again. So that's why it came up again as a major concern for them. And it probably lasted a couple of years at that stage. There we go, 2 years and several GBC meetings. He was permitted to keep initiating, but he was asked to draft a letter. That was presented and approved. These things can be found in the appendix. However, in 2011, a bunch of GBC members felt more should be done. We actually have, in Appendix H, it would appear, the discussions there. As I say, it's kind of odd because when you read the minutes that are sort of taken blow by blow, each person talking, it really does look at that point that the level of disapproval was riding high, and then all of a sudden we jump to the next day and he's approved to keep going. Something else has happened that's not on the record, and it's difficult to know exactly what happened there.
I think I'll just mention that, like what Kirtana Rasa Prabhu just shared, I encountered that quite regularly in my years as director of the CPO meeting. Like I remember at some international GBC meetings we'd be talking. I'm not referring here to the Lokanath Swami case, but we're referring to other cases or potential cases, and the questions, not from all members of ISKCON leadership, but from many, the question would come up, like once we were talking about processing a particular case of alleged, negligence, like negligence related to child maltreatment, child abuse, child neglect, and someone in the GBC immediately said, but he said, do you know how many disciples he has? And the implication was, and like Kirtana Rasa is making faces, and that's the faces I make too. That's the faces I made too. And but it was accepted. I'm not saying by everyone in the room, but by practically do you know how many disciples he had? And if we started even processing that case, what would that mean for ostensibly for the welfare of the disciples? But I guess, skeptical as I may be, the concern was more about the numbers in the institution, the finances, and I was incredulous. Maybe I hid, but I was just like, I didn't get it. I was just kind of stunned. I didn't even know what to do. I mean, I got used to it there, but the implication was, how can we process that case? And then overtly, do you know how many disciples he has? And I was just stunned, because it was like, well, what about like protection of children? What about the integrity of Prabhupada's movement?
Yeah.
Like, for me, those are the principles here. And again, related to what Kirtana Rasa shared earlier, apart from whether this one's rectified or whatever, but let's justice ought to be blind. I know in my service as child protection director, I was never out to get anybody. I was always as interested to find evidence or data that would acquit as data or information that would seem to convict. So it's just, but to consider how to process a case, whether to process a case based on how many disciples, how much political clout, control over people and money. I was just shocked. At the same time, that was just like a status quo. That was just status quo part of the culture, and clearly it continues today.
Yeah, like you say, it shows where the primary concerns are. Sorry, Kirtana Rasa.
Prabhu, you were shocked because you were operating from a position of integrity, and you expected and wanted others to do the same. And to not operate from a position of integrity in the Vaishnav culture is to deny the supremacy of Krishna. It's to deny that Krishna is the supreme controller. It's to say that our own adjustments, our own judgment, our own control mechanisms, our own political considerations take precedent over surrendering and having faith that Krishna is in control of this movement and that things will be okay. And we can look back at our history, our movement's history. The people selling the cheap record albums on the parking lot, the change up at the airports. Yeah. Look, Krishna is the richest person of all, right? If he wants to give us his money, he's going to give us his money. We don't have to cheat people for it. And that's the position we finally had to come to, because, so many court cases and so many failed experiments. But certainly when it comes to caring for our children, we have to be in that position. I mean, I remember Srila Prabhupada saying how the demigods are, lining up to take birth in our movement. And I can just see that line now where one of us, no, you go ahead. Really, I just go back there. I'm going to go to the back of the line for a while until these people get their act together. So anyway, not to make light of a hard subject.
Well, thanks for sharing that point. Thanks for sharing that support of what we expressed, and yeah, in my expressions and in some written pieces that I wrote, I would express that. I would, when I express like, yeah, the considerations amongst leadership was how many disciples, and like integrity or protection of children, it was hardly on the radar. And I would write, I said, look, I suggest that we cultivate trust, that by living principles of integrity, maybe, what, maybe not even transcendence, but just basic sattvic virtue, dharma, and also, of course, the transcendental principles that Prabhupada gives, which include, they don't contradict sattvic principles. Let's just trust we live principles of integrity. Then naturally, the Sankirtan movement, Prabhupada's movement, is going to thrive and expand in ways we can't even calculate.
Purity is the force. That's not just a slogan.
So very mindful that we're 80 minutes in and we're still maybe on part 2 of the panel report. We haven't even got yet to what do the panel think should be done. So I'll try and pace it up. I know some people get nervous about the length of these events, but we wanted to make sure we're doing a good, thorough job. So we can see that around 2011, at the request of the GBC, Lokanath initially at some stage, okay, I'll stop initiating. But then it looks like he was pressured and submitted the case that maybe he'll be released from that self-imposed restriction. There is a mention in a footnote here that the final word choice in this letter of confession rested potentially with editors. But like I say, you can see it all in the appendices, and you can actually see his inputs. So it's kind of all there in black and white. There's nothing hidden. All right, so there was a further restrictions, a 2-year moratorium on initiations in 2012, but that to be completed later that year because there was already time served. Restriction to only initiating in the subcontinent of India, all future disciples to receive the letter explaining the 1990 incidents, restriction traveling outside of the Indian subcontinent, and particularly a 5-year restriction going to the States. All those restrictions lifted in 2017, but the North American Council said, well, at least there has to be an active invitation, and you better avoid the area where you caused this problem. All right, so applicable law. Now, ISKCON does have a policy that all cases do go to the CPO, and obviously that has not been followed on this occasion. But they're arguing, but there was an investigation, there was an adjudication on prior occasions. This is where they're trying to start arguing it doesn't need to go to the CPO. Explicit procedures for further review. So now they're starting to quote various bases on why they feel the case should be closed. So, was the process fair and impartial? That you will be able to see. It was disputed. Is there any new evidence? No, in fact, there's general agreement. There's no new evidence, as in what is known now in 2022. And at the time when the panel were doing this in 2021 is the same things that were known in 2012. However, the fact that we can see that the process hasn't been fair and impartial, and we can see that the restrictions are woefully light. That's where there was dissension amongst the panel members. 3 people arguing, just close the case. 2 people arguing, no, I'm sorry, that's not okay. It's not been impartial. It's not been fair. And the restrictions are woefully light. I'll pause just if you have any comments on what I'm saying at the moment.
It's interesting to see how they're applying one standard to India and another standard to North America. It's almost like there's a tacit position that it's okay to have a child molester be a guru in India, but we can't have that in North America because the North Americans won't accept it. But it's okay to do it in India. I mean, where is that coming from? Right.
Taking that as a rhetorical question.
Yeah, it's a rhetorical question. It's a rhetorical question.
We can see some really interesting little sleight of hand use here. A new trial is allowed if individuals come forward with allegations against the same respondent, or there's new evidence suggesting innocence. But since the 1993 and 2012 decisions were not made by the CPO procedures do not apply. So in other words, 1993, okay, no CPO existed. 2012, it definitely did. But because you didn't have a say then, you can't have a say now. I mean, it's just really
circular argument.
Circular reasoning. And the fact is I forget which year that the GBC made the undertaking, the promise, in essence, to the population of ISKCON. We will refer everything to CPO. Clearly, they keep making exceptions in this one case. How interesting that this will be the one case that they do that. Right, and now they come to this thing about the task force. So they've just said, CPO, your rules don't apply because you didn't have it yet. So nah. Now they're saying, oh, okay, but the CPO does have this provision for a task force. So, and then they sort of argue, I'm just going to scroll down to it. They argue, we reckon this committee, our subcommittee right now, we can be a task force. You get a mention here, Dhira Govinda. So I don't know if you have a view on the original intent of task force as something that would potentially sit alongside CPO or maybe preceded CPOs. And do you have any views as to this committee simultaneously arguing, CPO, you have no jurisdiction here, and then sort of saying, but we're going to legitimize what we're doing here on the basis that the CPO have this task force kind of component?
Well, the GBC established the Child Protection Task Force early in 1997. I was not on that task force. I wasn't really involved in the international scene at that time. And the task force, well, first of all, I commend the GBC for establishing that task force, and maybe they did it because they felt the pressure. They felt the pressure. There was the threats of the lawsuit, but anyhow, they formed the task force, and the task force came out with I thought an excellent document to form the Child Protection Office, and to fund an international child protection office with regional offices. And to the GBC's credit, early in 1998, the GBC accepted the task force report, and they asked me to be the kind of the founding director, and they did get funding. They gave substantial funding to get the office going, and the way the structure with which the office was set up, it was praised, and not just set up, but the way it was functioning. It was praised by legal professionals in the field of therapy and social services. So the GBC deserves credit for that. And then after I became director, then I was serving on the task force, and I thought it was a very nice relationship, and the task force. Because after we functioned for 6 months, for a year, 2 years, then we could see, okay, the task force report. This was very helpful and very excellent. At the same time, we could based on practical track record, we can revise this. We can see that doesn't quite apply, and so there were revisions, and those revisions have continued. So the task force is a very good idea, and I believe it's functioned very well. As far as the Lokanath case continually not going to the CPO, like, again, when I was CPO director, I never advocated for Lokanath case to go to the CPO if the GBC actually had a credible, reasonably professional report, which they didn't. But anyhow, this part of the report, it seems like some fancy tap dancing.
Well, here we go. Under the scheme of the task force, it should have reevaluated whether or not this case went to CPO for re-adjudication. It did not. There's not even really an attempt to explain, other than we hear here. Ravinder Swarup basically let you know, well, we've grandfathered it in, meaning it's already been dealt with by the committee. We procured a professional assessment. So also, we want to make sure we keep it confidential because we're a bit worried that Mr. Pandey, the father, might go violent on, so if we don't hide it from the victim's family, we're worried about the safety of some of our people. It's saying here, yes, you considered those maybe quite reasonable. Here we go. The panel suggests that it is appropriate for it under the current mandate to act as an advisory ad hoc task force. So that task force idea, we'll have that. We'll be that. So that's where I think the inter alia came from, just a little attempt within the tap dance to do the soft shoe shuffle. The CPO chair had but one vote amongst many. We didn't know what the vote of the other members would have been. So they're also saying, anyway, there's no reason why, even if it had gone to the task, it would have necessarily gone the way that the CPO might have expected. And panel also suggesting that the task force would have been the appropriate way, acknowledging that the GBC did their own thing again. And just sort of scanning here. I'm mindful we're trying to cover as much as we can. All right, so then the panel suggests this is what now needs to be. Is there adequate documentation? Was the process fair? Was the sentence determined? Was the sentence clearly inappropriate? Now, the panel actually have a bit of a debate, because some of them are going, unless you prove it was clearly inappropriate, even if someone could make the argument it wasn't appropriate, it has to be demonstrated to be clearly inappropriate. This is purely the bias of whoever wrote the report. And we can see that that's actually disputed. Was the sentence followed? Well, they make this term substantially because it clearly wasn't. No new parties alleging abuse, no new evidence. That's fair enough. All right, so we're reviewing the two. Okay, so now we start to get the panel's own point of view. Discussion, majority. So they acknowledge that there's a majority and minority views, very much skewed by the membership. So we're still left asking the question, why did avowed supporters of Lokanath end up essentially having the casting vote? 40% of the voting weight was given to them. It seems like whoever wrote this, and we're assuming it was probably Naveen Sharma who wrote this, absolutely wrote it with, make this look like we did a reasonable job and it can all just go away. And it was written with that briefing. That's certainly how it reads. Okay, so we're looking out for the asterisk because that will tell us where there was disagreement. Is there adequate documentation of an earlier process? There's a general sense of yes. There is pretty much we have Yasoda Davies' interview notes, and there's the documentation, so it kind of passes that. Therefore, on that basis, if that was the sole criteria, then that goes with the idea of closing the case. So there was documentation throughout. Was the process fair? Now we see the asterisk. So this is where there were different opinions. Apart from the correctness of any decisions made, how was that decision arrived? So the difficulty here is that what is a fair process when the GBC makes an administrative decision and when a CPO panel adjudicates a rights-based decision are different. So, for example, under current CPO guidelines, cases are heard and decided by review panels whose 3 members are chosen from a list of devotees that have been trained in the proper responses to child abuse and evaluating evidence and so on. And there is disclosure if there's in any way something that might injure their impartiality, any kind of bias. When the GBC as a body decides a disciplinary case, it does not appear that those provisions are in place to exclude a particular member from voting based on lack of qualification or familiarity with the subject. And we see the same thing basically in the panel. there's members there that are given a vote who have neither a legal background nor a child protection background, and they're given as much weighting as former CPO directors. Rigorous evidentiary process. So we're seeing these contrasts, and clearly this is where there was a difference of opinion. I'll pause now to see if either of you want to comment on that before we go through a little bit more.
Again, I keep coming back to, it's far too elaborate and there's far too many details, and it's all done to obfuscate the basic fact that he confessed. You know, and if you want to talk about whether the sentence was appropriate or not, let's compare the ecumenical sentence to what the secular sentence could have been. The secular sentence could have been 7 years in prison. And they're thinking that this little tiny tap on the wrist about don't initiate for a little while and then you can go back to India and have everything be okay. They're thinking that's a fair and appropriate sentence when he could have been a convicted sex offender for the rest of his life and done 7 years in prison. Well, it's again the us and them mentality that we live in this insular society and somehow or other, by virtue of being devotees, we're above the law.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. Like, okay, I know on Vedic Inquirer, maybe a few months or a year ago, I wrote some things about this aspect of this process, this case. And I said, like, yeah, like, let's not be in any illusion, any pretense that there's any semblance of blind justice here. For example, apart from secular law, okay, let's just say that someone, so maybe a temple devotee, maybe someone in the congregation, was, whether now or 10 or 30 years ago, it became known that this happened, apart from how secular law would handle it. You know. But then, okay, so then, you know, the temple president, maybe the GBC, maybe the child protection team, and say, oh yeah, here's, say, a congregation member or someone who leads kirtan once in a while, and they acted in a sexually inappropriate way to an 11-year-old girl. Okay, so then it would be seen, oh, okay, yeah, should he be allowed to come to the Sunday feast? For sure, he shouldn't be giving the Bhagavatam class. He shouldn't be, like, you know, pujari on the altar. Okay, if he's allowed to come to the Sunday feast, the parents should be warned. And okay, that would be the discussion. And as that's the sort of discussions we had lots of times as child protection director. And even today, people from different sectors of the devotee community call me and ask kind of consultation how to handle a situation. See, like whether he should be allowed to come to the Sunday feast. If so, he should be monitored closely. You know, like that. Okay, so that's where it would be handled. Okay, that would be the discussion, and some would think, you know, let's be more lenient. Let's be more strict. Okay, that would be the discussion. Here, the discussion is whether the molester of the 11-year-old should be worshipped as non-different from God.
It's pretty absurd when you put it that way.
I'm just putting it as it is, and
I know. I mean, I'm not faulting how you put it. I'm just saying, you know, it's like it's an absurdity. It's an absurdity that we have to even have this debate.
Yeah. It's beyond absurd. It's beyond absurd. Let's not pretend there's any sort of blind justice happening.
There was a case where Srila Prabhupada, I think it was in San Francisco. I'm pretty sure it's in the third volume of Lilamrita, where a devotee is helping him fill out his immigration form, and he's applying for permanent visa. And the devotee, and I forget who the devotee was, gets to the question about, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And Srila Prabhupada let him know in no uncertain terms that this is not the kind of question that a disciple should be asking his spiritual master. You know, first of all, of course he hadn't, because he came from a very respectable, aristocratic Bengali family, and they're just, you know, of course he didn't commit a crime. But then here's this disciple having to ask his guru, have you committed a crime? Mm-hmm. And we've gone from that to the scenario that you posit, that we've got someone whose picture is on the altar who sexually assaulted an 11-year-old, and they're worshiping him. It's like a Twilight Zone episode.
Twilight Zone, yeah. And I would say that Twilight Zone is generous. It's Twilight Zone, or less generously, it's like Jonestown.
Yeah, that's right. This is, well, okay. So the people who wrote this report should send their resumes to Fox News, because this is the kind of propaganda that it is.
Maybe we'll help them out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I quoted that Voltaire quote the other day on the Vedic Inquirer: "Those who can make you believe absurdities will, in fact, help you commit atrocities."
Right.
So definitely an atrocity has gone unpunished here. There is a little footnote we can see here. Regardless of whether ISKCON's internal process was fair, it does appear that the incidents in question should have been reported, and we can see from 1990 onwards, New Jersey has a statute that requires mandatory reporting of any person having reasonable cause to believe a child has been subjected. So GBC ignored that statute. And they ignored even their own policies. 1989, incidents of child molestation within ISKCON or ISKCON-related organization must be reported by ISKCON authority to the local government agency. So that was 4 years earlier. Ignored. GBC resolution of 1990, suspected or confirmed case of child abuse must be reported to local government. Ignored. Yeah, so I mean, we can see the panel certainly, even if it still comes to its skewed conclusion, doesn't spare the GBC any its blushes. We can see it's just a catalogue of mishandling. So just back to, did the GBC actually follow its own due process? And here, viewed from the perspective of a CPO panel, the process was substandard in that the members of the committee were not vetted for bias. This is the unanimous view of the panel. Notwithstanding, the committee should be viewed as a hybrid, a majority, so some people on the panel, notably Lokanath supporters, having the swing vote. Under general principles of due process, we're going to completely ignore whether or not there was bias, but otherwise, we follow due process. The majority says that the process was perhaps adequate, well-informed decision, expert input, close the case. Right, now in italics here, this is where the 40% of people who are outvoted, notably the two child protection directors, former Tamoha and Champakalada. The dissenting view is all of that's just been expressed as fallacious reasoning, as the committee was not vested with the authority to make a decision. And secondly, the GBC, having not been placed with the full facts by the committee, made an uninformed decision, an insidious position that resulted in the ratification of the recommendations, further compounding an unfair process. In other words, how it was even put to the GBC when the GBC initially approved what the committee had done, they were not told the whole story. Therefore, the process wasn't fair. The dissenting view wishes to emphasize that the committee could not have been the final trier of fact. GBC adjudications on misconduct are almost always decided by the full GBC after input and recommendations. So they're now, we're getting the breadcrumbs left by those who essentially couldn't carry the day, being outnumbered, of just how, this was just a sham, really.
Well, in any criminal case, there's two stages. You made me think of this when you referenced the trier of fact. There's no facts to be tried here. The facts are not in dispute because we have a confession. So that stage of the proceeding doesn't even need to be dealt with. He's guilty by his own admission. The other stage that needs to be dealt with is the sentencing stage. So forget about there being a trier. In fact, there's no facts to try. There's an admission. The only issue in controversy should be, what do we do with them now? What's the appropriate sentence? And so this brings us to actually a larger, more global issue, a macro issue. We're dealing with a micro issue with one individual. The macro issue is the systemic failure on the part of our society in handling this, the failure of the GBC. So that's actually the elephant in the room. course, I know that's probably beyond the scope of what we're doing here tonight, but what we're dealing with tonight is only because of a huge systemic failure on the part of our society.
But I think it's actually one of the big reasons the Vedic Inquirer has picked up the Lokanath case, because some people go, why so much emphasis on this one offender, and haven't there been any other offenders? No, we'll get to other offenders, but this case does point directly to collusion by the senior most leadership body to protect a person from the consequences of their criminal actions and to even uphold them as a guru. What? It's just unbelievable. And their fingerprints are all over it. And that's what the report says for anyone who's reading it. And despite their best efforts to actually conceal that below all this obfuscation, it's there if you just read what it's actually saying. And that's why we want to help readers not be kidded by the gloss and the smoke and mirrors, but to actually see exactly how the skullduggery is being executed here.
The thing that's really at stake here, and going back to the issue of integrity, is the functionality of our institution. I'm not sure how accurate the comparison would be, but I'm reminded of Julius Caesar in 53 or 52 or BCE, where he was going back to Rome after his genocide in Gaul, and he crossed the Rubicon River, which was the river dividing Italy from Gaul. And by crossing the Rubicon, even with only one Roman legion, which was not a sizable force at all, it was considered an act of treason, and he broke Roman law. And it was the beginning of the end of the Republic and the senatorial governance of Rome. He, in like a needle, out like a plow, even though he crossed the Rubicon with a small force, the act itself was so symbolic that it ended up, the end of the Republic. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a systemic failure similar to the Roman Senate, maybe, but because this person has 5,000-6,000 disciples, the question, as Dhira Govinda was saying, people are asking themselves this question. But look at how many disciples does he have? What's going to happen to our movement? Well, our movement's going to implode if we abandon integrity. Our movement is going to come apart at the seams, lose credibility. No one's going to join, and people are going to leave if we lose our integrity. And if we have to undergo a civil war to preserve that integrity, then, hey, Arjuna didn't run away from Kurukshetra, right? And if we have to have a Kurukshetra, of course, politically, not by force of arms, I'm not espousing violence, then we have to have one. And there's going to be casualties. But the alternative is Julius Caesar takes over and the Republic is lost.
Yeah, it's the test of one grain of rice kind of metaphor as well that Dhira Govinda had used. It sets a very ugly precedent because it essentially says if you've got enough disciples or enough leverage, as in you've got, ISKCON India on your side who can threaten to take away all the India temples, you can pretty much get away with anything. And, you can bet that your cronies will back you. They make the point here about at least the appearance of a conflict of interest because Lokanath Swami was a fellow of the GBC. He was, in and amongst them. So for them to say, we've made this decision, didn't have all the facts. Even the person who did the investigation was a disciple of one of the committee members. And so, there is no due process. And therefore, to try and argue things like, you can't try a person again, double jeopardy. Well, that assumes that the initial investigation actually followed any kind of due process. Anyway, so you can see the dissent are leaving their, their little breadcrumbs for everybody to be able to pick up here and see. By definition, categorically, an unfair process. All right, so then we come back to non-italic. So this is the majority again. The subsequent review was deliberately undertaken following normal GBC protocols, more exacting judicial standard. Oh, it's only Satya's testimony. Yes, the earlier process was fair. So again, they're saying, yeah, as far as they're concerned, here we see the asterisk, the clue that there was a dissenting voice. Again, the two former CPO directors saying, here we go, the minority differs, because for the reasons stated in the 1933 assessment, there was no impartiality. Further supported by the fact that other cases involving devotees of equal stature were referred to the CPO, and they mentioned Damodara Swami. So why is he getting a different treatment, basically? Was a sentence determined? Yes. And so they kind of go through what the sentences were each time. And they don't obviously dispute, yes, there was a sentence. Then it becomes a question of, was that sentence adequate? Was the sentence clearly inappropriate? Now, this is kind of interesting, right? Because clearly inappropriate is different than saying was the sentencing appropriate. I might pause just to see if either of you have got any comments on that little bit of fun and games. Was it clearly inappropriate? So the burden of proof now being someone to show that, you know, it was absolutely out of line what was done previously, as opposed to what was done previously was fair and above board.
The sentence was clearly inappropriate. It was clearly inappropriate in that it wasn't really a sentence. You know, they want to start throwing around terms such as double jeopardy. That's a secular criminal term. You can't have it both ways. You can't divorce yourself from the secular criminal court system and law enforcement authorities and then seek the protection that is afforded in that system, such as things like double jeopardy. And double jeopardy applies against the government retrying someone who's already been acquitted. You know, so he was never tried. He confessed. The government wasn't involved. So, you know, don't step over into my turf unless you really want to be on my turf. And if you want to be on my turf, let's go there all the way. You know, let's march Lokanath into the police station down in New Jersey and say, here's his confession. Here's the girl. Let him plead guilty. Let him step up to the plate and do the honorable thing and turn himself into law enforcement and say, yeah, I did this. Now, I don't know if the statute of limitations is told in New Jersey or not. Many states around the country have extended or the statute of limitations, just like on a homicide. There is no statute of limitations. Some states are going over to that model for sexual crimes against children. But, you know, this sentence didn't involve stripping him of his danda. It didn't involve taking away his disciples. It didn't involve taking away managerial authority. It certainly didn't involve incarceration. And there's an argument that any and all of those things would have been appropriate, given the heinous nature of this crime. And so, yeah, the sentence was clearly inappropriate because it was just almost non-existent.
His apologists try to make, you know, something out of that. Well, you know, if the Pandey family had really had an issue and felt that they had watertight evidence, they would have prosecuted. Of course, what's not clear is they were actually persuaded otherwise by the GBC.
Sure.
Let us handle it on false pretenses that we will strip him of his powers and those kind of things. Dhira Govinda, anything to say on this clearly inappropriate clause?
I actually appreciated that the report went there. I'm fine with that they went there, and I didn't closely study everything, but then the minority opinion was that it was outside of the realm of reasonable. I mean, I appreciate that approach that in a sentencing, and I appreciate what Kirtana Rasa said. There wasn't really a sentence. Okay, like there might be like. Okay, more lenient here, like maybe from a 20 to 80% range like that. And the minority view is, it was clearly inappropriate. And then it's kind of like, sure, that, you know, earlier I gave the example of if someone did that from the congregation or a bhakta or something, okay, it would be like, can he come to the Sunday feast or not? Can he visit the temple to take darshan of the deities? You know, and then like, and then there's, you know, there's a range of reasonable decision making, and there's a range there, you know, like that. But here, kind of like that, the sentence is that whatever, after 2 years, he can still be worshipped as as the absolute person, as non-different than the absolute personality of Godhead, what language do we use? Like if that's not like ludicrous, then what is?
So I'm mindful we're coming up to the 2-hour mark. We got 27 pages in, or something like, no, 31 pages into a 71-page report. I'm not suggesting we keep plowing on, and I think 2 hours was your limit, if I remember right, Dhira Govinda.
Yeah, 2 hours. Yes, I have another 5 to 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, so my view is maybe we'll call this a part one, and we'll cover off the rest of the report in another. There's plenty more to come. We've actually only really just started looking at the panel and the fact that they were divided often on matters of fairness and so on. So I wonder if in the 5 minutes or so that we have before we hit the 2-hour mark, I can ask you for your sort of intermediate concluding comments. Kirtana Rasa, obviously we've still got aspects of the report to look at, but what would you like to leave viewers with based on what the discussion has been about today?
Well, I think that what we have to do is embrace some core principles when it comes to protecting our children. One of the core principles is that we're not above the law. We have to recognize the fact that we live in a secular world, and even though there's a natural tendency to think of us and them, devotees, non-devotees, etc., we can't have the fox in charge of the henhouse. We have to have an outside authority. We have to be as responsible to the society we live in as everybody else. And that means when crimes against children are perpetrated, the leadership in our movement needs to have their default setting is call the police, call in law enforcement, call in the district attorney's office, and not leave it all up to us. And if we did that, this political tipping point that we're at now, with India threatening to secede from the rest of ISKCON, could have been avoided, because the New Jersey law enforcement authorities aren't going to give a damn about what India ISKCON does. They're going to do their job, and they're going to investigate, and they're going to prosecute. The other thing is we have to remove politics from societal, institutional decisions, because if we let politics govern the day, we are renouncing our philosophical position that Krishna is the supreme controller and that we are ultimately all dependent upon him. So if we're not going to be devotees, then fine, let's not be devotees. But if we're going to be devotees, that's the position we have to start with, and we always have to come back to. Jimmy Carter wrote an excellent book. He said it was his most important book, A Call to Action. And getting back to what Dhira Govinda said earlier, it's about how the human rights of women and children around the world are the foremost civil rights issue today. And it's a wonderful book. It's not very long. It's thought-provoking. It's brilliant. I wrote him a really nice letter of appreciation about it. He wrote me a handwritten note back thanking me. So it was very nice. I wrote it to him on the Care for Vrindavan letterhead, because I used to be president for Care for Vrindavan. And so, and I sent him a brochure with our mutual friend Peter Burwash's picture in it. But anyway, I digress. So we have to make systemic changes in how we approach these. Divorce ourselves from political considerations, realize that we accept Krishna as God and as the supreme controller, bring in the secular authorities, and have equal justice for all. If we can't allow convicted or admitted sexual predators to be in positions of authority, regardless of what reformation they've undergone, it's just really terrible optics for a preaching mission.
Thank you, Prabhu. Concluding words from you, Dhira Govindaji?
Hare Krishna. Hearing Kirtana Rasa Prabhu's closing comments, like this document again. I read it. You're going through it, Damodara Prabhu, and it's a legal document, and I'm saying it's a political document, and the way I define politics. It's a political document, and some might regard it as an effectively written political document, be that what it is. And I'm not saying politics are bad. I mean, there's a place for politics, including in societies attempting to be spiritual. At the same time, here, earlier Kirtana Rasa said that the purity is the force. It's not meant to be like a cliche, right? So I know, hoping to cultivate some purity in myself, so I can be, I can enhance my potency for serving Srila Prabhupada's movement and the community of Srila Prabhupada's followers from a place of principle and integrity. And so those I guess my pearls or my takeaway from these 2 hours, that in integrity, principle, purity is the force. And it certainly seems to me that, okay, however fancy and maybe legally smooth the dancing might be, and it might not at all be, as some of you have picked this apart, this document. It seems, I know I keep coming back to this point that, okay, you got someone who molested an 11-year-old girl, and again, I don't know what's happening in his heart. I'm not commenting on his level of purity, but that he's worshipped as non-different from Krishna. That's just like that just seems like a gross violation of the integrity of Prabhupada's movement, of Prabhupada's teachings. And Kirtana Rasa used the term optics, like and that's the optics, truth is stranger than fiction. I don't think we could write a fictionalized novel with more shocking with a more shocking plot. I don't think we could do it.
No, you're right.
We couldn't do it. Truth is stranger than fiction. And so the only way you can get around that is to try to do some clever tap dancing. And I appreciate, Damodara, you're trying to pierce through the tap dancing. So, like, look what's happening here. So, I don't know, principle, integrity, purity is the force. Jai Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.
Thanks. Thank you to both of you for your patient exposition over this last couple of hours. Clearly, it is a part one, and we'll have to get to a part two. I think we're actually over the halfway point, even if it might not seem that. I think we have actually broken the back of it. And we've yet to even look at the appendices. Goodness me. Again, you can find this report and you can find the appendices on lokanath.net. So I'd encourage everybody to read those. And just to give you a sense of the kind of stuff that's in the appendices, of course, they're not labeled especially, helpfully on the front page. But as you go through, you've got the verbatim transcription of the interview with Satya and her mother. You've then got Satya's 2010, updated testimony. You've got Lokanath Swami's testimony, although you've got that often, coming through others. You've got the various letters that Lokanath himself wrote, including the final text, but you've even helpfully got all of the different edits that were being made. And you can actually see Lokanath Swami's own comments in and amongst those. So, if there's any doubt about authorship, those should be laid to rest by that. What else have you got here? We've got, and the various versions of the letter and so on. You've got a few appendices like that. Appendix G, this is a big one because this is where the GBC start expressing their outrage upon finding out, based on Satya's updated testimony, what they hadn't been told before. And initially it was very surprising that Lokanath got more than just another slapped wrist as a consequence of this discussion. You've got, I think we've already read this, but you've actually got, the report by Bir Krishna Maharaj. What else have you got here? You've got how the GBC initially communicated things. you've actually gotten somewhere in here. You've even got like the entire CPO handbook. So I won't go further because I realize that we've already gone a long time. A massive thank you to you both for making the time to be here. I think it goes a long way to helping, you know, the inexperienced reader make sense of what's in this document. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. See you all again soon. If you liked this video, please share it so that it does the rounds and others get to understand what's going on. I'll end the broadcast now. Please stay on for a moment or two, both of you.